Um, there we go. Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to have an interview today with Cylita Guy. Dr. Guy is a research associate at the University of Toronto and does really interesting research on bats and viruses, which we're going to be chatting about, and also does amazing SciComm initiatives as well as just had a book accepted for publication on SciComm, I believe. Yeah, so that's really exciting. So we're going to chat with her a little bit about her work today. So first off, I always like to start off with the research side of things. So can you chat a little bit about your research with bats and viruses? As you said on your website, bats seem to be good at carrying viruses that they sometimes share with humans, but they don't get sick themselves. So why is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And if I had the answer to that question, I would probably have a lot of very fancy grants, and lots of people would like to collaborate with me.
Oh,
But so ultimately, I study a type of a class of viruses known as zoonotic viruses. So these are diseases that can jump from animals into humans. Examples include things like SARS, which you might be familiar with,
yeah.
influenza or flu, which we have seasonal outbreaks of that. And so these viruses are increasing kind of in their frequency of jumping into humans. So we're really interested in trying to figure out ways to stop them. So I study them in bats, and bats seem to be like among mammals, they seem to be particularly good at carrying these viruses. We think that it might be because their immune systems are, a little bit different from other mammals. If you think about it, bats are the only mammals that can fly.
Right.
And the changes that they would have had to undergo to make that possible, there's probably a number of changes that would have had to happen. And so some of the kind of tools that they developed to deal with the stress of flight might be maybe being, wow, co-opted to help them deal with their viral infections. Or it could be that because their body temperatures are always spiking in flight, that maybe that helps them to control their viral infections as
That's
well.
cool.
Uh, there are lots of hypotheses in the literature, but we don't quite have the answer yet. But we're learning more and more and more about how their kind of natural history and their ecology and the way that they live their lives is contributing to how viruses spread among their populations.
That's really exciting. What are some of the techniques that you're using to try to figure that out?
Yeah, so I do a little bit of a couple different things. So I actually do not work in a lab. I've never done any lab work to
Very
tackle
cool.
these questions. People who do lab work to tackle these questions are awesome. They're very important. I'm just not really interested in doing that. So I do a bit of field work. So I
Mhm.
did a 2-year field project in the city of Toronto trying to understand how bats shift their behavior in
Mhm.
city landscapes and what that might mean for us, putting us humans at kind of risk for coming into greater contact with them. I then do like a little bit of comparative stuff. So I look at species across the globe, and I built like a large trait data set. So I have a whole bunch of bats. I know that some of those bats carry viruses, some of them do not.
Mhm.
I know where these things like where these bats live, how big they are, how many babies they have. And then I use machine learning to try to predict which of the bats that we don't know anything about actually might be carrying something that we haven't detected yet. So to kind of help prioritize where we look for viruses in the future.
Awesome. And just real quickly, because a lot of our audience, they're interested in science, but they aren't scientists themselves. Can you just
Mm-hmm.
say what machine learning is?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that catch. So machine learning, it can be a lot of things, but essentially we're instead of me saying, okay, I think all of these things are related in this way,
Mhm.
I let a computer program or an algorithm figure out those patterns in the data for me.
Very
And
cool.
then that algorithm will build a model that is really good for predicting or making guesses about, like, we don't really know anything about, these bats, but we think that this subset of them, based on the information that you've already given me, you should probably look at.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
No problem.
And also, you're very passionate about SciComm. You're really active on Twitter. And I've read that you started a junior bat biologist citizen science program with the Hyde Park Nature Center, which is really cool. And you're also one of the lead organizers of ComSciCon Canada.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah, just making sure I got that right. Which is coming up next year in the spring, right?
Yes.
Cool. So that's a really cool idea because I've actually never heard of a SciComm conference before. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you got involved with that?
Yeah, so ComSciCon, wow, see, even I have a hard time saying it. ComSciCon is actually something that was started at Harvard University in the States in 2013. So they've had several American workshops. And so in, I don't know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they decided they were going to open these American workshops to Canadians. And so I was one of the first Canadians invited down to the flagship workshop in Boston. We had a really great time. There were eight other Canadians at the meeting, and we were all kind of like, a lot of what we get requests to do sometimes as people who are experienced in science communication is like, how do I, as another grad student, get started? And so we thought it was really important to launch this sort of training and leadership building opportunity in the country. And so last year, we brought it to Canada for the first time. It was a blast. We had a full-on national meeting. So we had students from coast to coast come to McMaster in Hamilton, Ontario. And we had 2.5 days of amazing collaborations and learning and networking. And so this year, part of what we would like to see happen is the science communication community in Canada is kind of spread out. It's a little disparate and disjointed, and it's hard to integrate yourself if you're not necessarily a quote unquote professional science communicator. You don't work in a museum, you're not a science journalist. And so we want to work to kind of contribute to bringing the community together. And so we're actually this year hosting our meeting in conjunction with the Canadian Association for Science Centers annual meeting. So we're going to bring together this group of very professional science communicators, this group of, also doing very professional science communication and kind of building out their portfolios to see if we can generate some useful collaborations for some of our participants in science museums.
Very cool. Yeah, I've been seeing, like, as a scientist, I've been seeing a lot of other scientists get involved in SciComm as well. So, I mean, a lot of us, like, we publish and we work on, like, writing papers, but there seems to be, like, more and more of a movement, at least from my perspective, of trying to also speak to people who might be lay people in science. Have you seen that as well on your side?
Oh, absolutely. I think a lot of the graduate students in my cohort were very involved in their local communities or writing, and I think largely because of the way that we now communicate, thinking about digital media, thinking about Twitter, thinking about Instagram, it has really opened up the door for, you don't have to be publishing in a traditional sense, like in a science articles in magazines. People can now kind of self-publish, and it has led to a lot of people practicing and playing with it. And I think that's great. I think that all scientists would benefit from communication training, because regardless of whether or not they want to talk to the public, communication training will help you talk to other scientists better. That leads to more efficient collaborations. That leads to better conference talks. And I think for those scientists that do want to invest time in sharing the results with the public, and I mean, the public is a nebulous term because that always like shifts. Right. But, whether that's kindergartner classrooms, whether that's other scientists who are non-specialists, whether that's policy folks, I think that all graduate students, I think that all scientists should have opportunities to this training so that they can better distill what they're doing in non-traditional formats.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I also think as conservationists, a lot of our work is really applied, which means that we're working with people who are not necessarily like in our field. So you're working with all kinds of different stakeholders. So I think it's important to be able to know how to talk to those guys.
Absolutely.
Very cool. So what sparked your personal passion for SciComm?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No worry. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's funny. I was doing science communication long before I was like ever a scientist in the traditional sense.
Oh, cool.
So I started at 17. I was in a very cool high school program where they took 50 students, 50? No, 25. I can't remember the number. Anyways, they took a bunch of students from across Ontario, and they brought you in to do one of your high school semesters at the Ontario Science Center, which is,
really cool.
Canada's largest science center. And so I got to do a whole high school semester. I took all of my courses there, and then I had one of our kind of periods of the day was not quite an elective, but we were working with the exhibit design teams to develop ideas and pitch to them. And so that was really cool, really interesting. And so as part of that, though, I also got to volunteer on the floor of the Science Center. So working with high school students to do puzzles, working in their school programs, to do different activities with different age groups. And then because of that, I was hired kind of my summer in between high school and university as a student host. So I got to work on the floor, helping people find their way, hosting our exhibits, and kind of, we always like to think of as hosts like people refer to us as a scientist at the Science Center because we do wear lab coats and we are on the floor and we do demos, but we're kind of there to facilitate people's experiences. And so then I actually transitioned from a student job to like a full host position, and I did that throughout university. I did that through my PhD. I did that for 10 years. And I only very recently resigned to kind of pursue other independent pursuits. But yeah, so for me, I was very lucky. Like that is a unique experience that not a lot of people get to have. Working in a science museum and constantly having to rethink the way that I was explaining things and try and test and also learning. Like I was not just in our dedicated human bio and ecology area. I was delivering planetarium shows.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
dealing with physics. I would have to sometimes learn something and then 5 minutes later get on stage and address a crowd of 500 people. So it helped me develop a lot of really useful skills that then when I was in grad school, I was able to be like, okay, I want to develop this community science program and I want to talk to kids about bats. I already have the skills to do that. I knew something about curriculum development and design, so that really helped me kind of pitch to teachers. I had some experience like writing for more general is not a good, but like more non-specific or non-specialist audiences. So yeah, that's how I got started, and I'm really grateful for that experience.
That's really cool. And I've noticed something that like sometimes when you're speaking with kind of non-specific audiences, they will ask you questions outside your field, especially if they're kids. So like I just did a Skype a scientist session with like a group
Mm-hmm.
of fourth graders, and one of the questions was, "What is gravity?" And I'm like, I work with goats and lions, but I can take a shot at this. So that was
Yeah,
pretty.
no, it's so true. You have to be ready for everything and anything, especially with kids,
Yeah,
especially kids.
they
Yeah.
ask some really hard questions.
Yeah, they do.
Very cool. So what's some of the impacts of SciComs that you personally witnessed? Do you have any cool anecdotes about that?
Oh, I mean, I have so many cool anecdotes. I have like really powerful, because I was at the Science Center for so long, I've had some like really powerful experiences where, a kid that I worked with when they were 4,
Mhm.
comes back 3 years later. I remember this one kid specifically was really into robots, and we didn't at the time have a dedicated robotics exhibit or kind of anything on the floor, but we did have this extension. There are these things called jackbots, and they look like little houses on wheels, but
Mhm.
kids can insert these discs into them and essentially program them.
Oh,
So
cool.
like it goes straight, and then I want it to turn left, and then I want it to spin in a circle, and then I
Mhm.
want it to stop or repeat. So
Right.
really, really simple programming language. And so this kid was, I don't know, 3 or 4, and his mom comes up and is asking if I have anything, and I was like, well, we don't have an exhibit, but so I pulled out these jackbots, and we had a good time playing with them, and it was really fantastic. And then I saw them again 3 years later, and I didn't recognize them because
Mhm.
I was seeing hundreds of people a
Right.
day. But the mom recognized me,
Oh,
and she was like, yeah, our son really enjoyed that experience, and actually he's now in a robotics camp.
that's
Uh,
amazing.
and she's like, that's not just you, but like he had a really positive time doing that with you. My favorite though experiences are when I have like other young parents of, let's say parents with daughters, or in particular parents with children who are also part of like marginalized groups, right? So I'm a Black woman in a field where there aren't a lot of Black women. It's really powerful when parents say, pull me aside and are like, hey, I just need you to know that it is really great that my daughter or my son or whoever is hearing this message from you. Uh, yeah, so I've had a nice, yeah, I've had a lot of those really, really great experiences. I've seen positive impacts in so many visitors, but also adults when they're like, oh yeah, I finally get this. I finally understand this. And
Yeah.
when you're doing, I've spent a lot of time doing activities for kids that are designed to also pull in their parents. And so when you see parents then starting to facilitate the experience with the child themselves, I'm like, yes, my work here is done. This is the positivity that I wanted to create. So yeah,
That's
I've only had good experiences.
That's really cool. And I also think kind of the stereotype of science is that, it's really difficult and people, it's scary and inaccessible. And I think
Mhm.
just breaking down those boundaries and showing that, no, it's really, like it's a systematic way of looking at the world and there's so much you can do. And it's something that I think kids kind of do naturally because of their curiosity. So I think that's really cool. Very
Absolutely.
cool. Yeah, that's an awesome story. So back to bats, because I'm a
Hmm.
bat fan. So bats are pretty misunderstood. I mean, you see them on Halloween decorations as something kind of spooky. Even Batman wasn't sure about them in the beginning, to be fair.
Hmm.
Um, what are some of the most common misconceptions about them that you've come across in your work? And I guess the follow-up for that is like, how can people in their daily lives who aren't bat scientists kind of work on sharing what makes them unique and helpful?
Yeah, so there are lots of misconceptions. You'll hear a lot the phrase like blind as a bat. That's
Right.
not true. Our bats are not blind, although some of them have this really effective echolocation. So they're sending out these high frequency sonar waves that bounce off of objects, come back to them, and convey information about what is in their surroundings. But just because bats are echolocating, they still have eyes. Their eyes still work. It's just
Right.
some of them can't see as well. But
Hmm.
there are entire groups of bats that actually don't echolocate at all, and they rely entirely on their vision. And their vision is far better than any person seeing in the dark. Uh, the other one I hear a lot is they get stuck in your hair,
Right.
and no, no, they don't. Again, their
That's
echolocation is so good that like they're. I mean, sometimes they may fly close to you and they may clip you, but they're not going to get lodged in your hair. It's an old wives' tale.
right.
I mean, if we always joke that like if bats did get stuck in your hair, our lives would be so much easier catching them because they're very, very difficult to catch at times.
Wow. Yeah.
The other one that you hear a lot is like all bats feed on blood. They don't. There are three species of obligate blood feeders. They're the vampire bats.
Mhm.
They live in South America, but that's three species of, there are roughly 1,400
Wow.
different species or types of bats in the world. This is the second most species rich group of mammals, so warm-blooded fuzzy things that give birth to live babies.
Right.
So like 3 of 1,400 is no, definitely not all bats. Like I mean, there are bats that eat bugs, there are bats that eat fruit, there are bats that eat nectar. There's a huge diversity in the things that they eat and consume for their diets. And I guess the other one that I hear the most commonly is that bats are just flying rats with wings.
Right.
No, no, no. Separate groups. You've got rodents and then you've got bats. So completely different groups of mammals. And yes, I mean, a lot of them are small and brown and mousy and do kind of look like a rodent, but they're fundamentally different groups of animals.
Very cool.
Um, and so thinking about like what information that people might want to share on a daily basis to kind of help dispel this myth. The thing that a lot of people maybe don't realize is that bats are critical components of our ecosystems of like all animals and all plants and all insects are parts of our ecosystems that we need to
Hmm.
have everything run smoothly. But in particular, bats do a lot of really useful things for us as humans. The ones that feed on insects basically are like free pest control.
Sure.
They're getting rid of a lot of crop pests, often in areas where they are feeding over crops.
Hmm.
The ones that are feeding on nectar are pollinators, and they pollinate things like cocoa and durian and wild agave, which we use to make tequila. Uh, the bats that feed on fruit disperse seeds in the broader landscape, and that means that our forests are growing up strong and healthy and in the way that they should. So these animals do a lot of services to us. And I think that with nocturnal animals, there's kind of that like base fear, like it's
Right.
dark, we can't see what's happening, we don't know what's there. And I think that's where some of that fear comes from of these animals. Um, but also the fact that they do often get in people's homes, and that can be having a bat colony is a problem. It does need to be removed because it is a public health hazard, right? Having these animals living so close to you. But there are ways to do that ethically, and there are ways to make sure that you can put up a bat house on your property so that if they have to shift, maybe they shift to that house and hopefully not back into your home if you've had them excluded. Uh, so yeah, I think that's the one thing I always try to remind people is that one, they all things deserve to live on this planet.
Yeah.
But
That's important.
two, right, these animals do important things for us as humans and important things to make
Right.
sure that our ecosystems stay healthy.
That's cool. I'm gonna definitely tell them about the whole tequila and chocolate pollinating because I think a lot of people are gonna be like, if I want those things,
Yeah,
nice to
right.
bats.
Everybody likes tequila. I mean, I don't ask little kids that one because hopefully no kid is putting up their hand being like, I love tequila.
Yeah, that would be concerning. No, that totally makes sense. Very, very cool. I didn't know that much about what specifically they pollinate, so that's something new, and that's really
Yeah.
interesting. So you've been involved in some nonfiction books as well, which I wanted to ask you about. Um,
Mhm.
you've been involved in fieldwork fails. Can you kind of describe what that is? It's I know it's a big thing on Twitter.
Yeah, but if you're not on Twitter, you're kind of like, what is this? So fieldwork fails is a hashtag that a bunch of field scientists were using to share their most like ridiculous moments
Mhm.
in the field. Because as scientists, we make a lot of mistakes. Some of them are quite hilarious. Um, we're talking about accidentally swallowing a fossil while you were licking it, like gluing yourself to a crocodile,
Right.
while trying to radio tag it. And so this illustrator from France, a man by the name of Jim Jourdain, he
Mhm.
decided that he wanted to, bring some life to these like tweets. Um, and so he chose a few of them and he was illustrating them. He was putting them out on Twitter. And he was also doing this longer. He was giving some of us the opportunity to chat more about our study organisms and how that situation came about in the first place.
Right.
And so enough of us were kind of like, this is really cool and people really like these. You should put them into a book. You
Mhm.
should do this. And after I think of enough of us like being like, hey, can you please, when's the book coming? Can we do the book? Can we crowdfund the book? He started a Kickstarter campaign, he crowdfunded the book, and it came out a couple years ago. And so that was a really cool and exciting project. People can still purchase it if they want. He published it independently through his own publishing house. And it's just, I love it because it's a different way to look at science.
Mhm.
And it's a very humanizing way to look at science, right?
Right.
Like people sometimes are like, oh, you're a scientist? That's weird. You're too smart to talk to me. And it's like, no, 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 I'm a regular person. I make mistakes. It just so happens that my job is answering questions about this specific thing. It's
Right.
just like an office job. It's like other jobs. We just have not grown up, I guess, in a society where it's treated like other jobs.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just hilarious and they're ridiculous and I love it. I love that book.
What's your personal fieldwork fail?
Oh, so my fieldwork fail is was radio tracking what I thought was a bat for
Mhm.
like a half day in the hot sun. And it turns out that I was tracking crosswalks because the
Oh my
crosswalks in
gosh.
the city operate at the same frequency as some of our radio tags. Um, so yeah, that's actually what I was tracking was just like the safety assist sound crossing buttons on the
Oh my gosh.
crosswalk.
That's really funny. Very cool. And then you're also doing your own book, right? About urban ecology. Can you chat a little
Yeah,
bit about that?
yeah, so I'm really excited. I just had a book proposal successfully accepted. So, Annick Press, I am writing a children's nonfiction book for kind of kids 8 to 12
Very
for
cool.
Annick Press, and it's all about urban ecology. So, urban ecology is a fairly new
Mhm.
science. It's like not the idea that we would study wildlife in cities where they're also human is this very new kind of field of research
Right.
as a collection.
Mhm.
And so they thought it would be a really good opportunity to teach kids more about their local biodiversity. And so
Right.
this book will feature 8 scientists from across North America. And there's more of a focus, kind of like fieldwork fails on stories. So everyone's chapter is going to start with a story from a field,
Very
the
cool.
field, a kind of something that happened to them. We're going to talk a little bit about their work and why kids should care. And then
Mhm.
at the end of each chapter, we're giving kids activities to get them outside, to get them to appreciate the fact that when they see a tree, actually it's not a tree, it's a
Right.
specific type of tree. And that tree looks different from the tree down the street or the tree in my friend's backyard, but these trees do good things for us in cities.
Right.
So yeah, that's only one example, but I'm really excited. There's some really, really cool people who have agreed to participate in this project. And so I need to get it done by the beginning of January. So I've got a lot of writing to do
Oh my
over
gosh.
a
Yeah.
period.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome though. But I think it's really cool because cities is where most people are living nowadays. And I think, making it more accessible because I think well, I love BBC Earth and all those things. It does kind of perpetuate the idea that conservation happens away from us or like far away in
Yeah.
touch landscapes. And that's not the case, and I think it's really cool that there's a focus more on transformed landscapes and like, how can we get kids outside when they live in like the middle of New York City or something and be
Hmm.
able to be excited about that.
And the one of the resounding themes of this book that we want to come across, I say we, that I want to come across, and it's my book, right?
Right.
I'm told scientists, I'm used to being like, we, yes, huh? But that I really want to come across in this book is that conservation starts in your backyard.
Right.
You have to respect and care for what exists in your own kind of sphere of existence.
Mhm.
And if everybody did that, I mean, then we would be able to save, everything across the globe. But it's really to help promote that sense of stewardship over what you see and interact with on a daily basis.
Very cool. And I guess my last question is, for scientists, kind of similarly to the, oh my gosh, I'm gonna misprint ComSciCon Canada. Yes.
Yeah.
Um, so similarly to what we chatted about with that, do you have any advice for any scientists who are looking to get into SciComm, who are just starting out?
Yeah. I mean, try again, and don't be feel afraid if you don't get it right. I feel like I hear a lot of people who've just been like, oh yes, you're just good at it, and that's
Right.
not true. It's been 10 years, it's been a decade of
Right.
practicing and refining and doing things where I'm like, wow, I really missed the mark on sharing that message with this group, or that analogy was terrible, or this activity, what was I thinking when I created it? But it's about being committed to kind of really sitting down and thinking about what you're saying and thinking about who you're talking to and what they are most excited about. It would be worthwhile for anyone who's thinking about getting started. There are kind of online resources. I can't list any off the top of my head, but more and more, like when I give workshops, I share all of my slides on Twitter, and I do tweet threads so people can go through and look at those. And eventually, I'm hoping to have them recorded. I know that Samantha Yamin has a lot of great, or Science Sam has a lot of great resources on her website. And so, doing some research, finding those resources, but also just committing to a process of learning and failure, I think is a really important thing to remember when you're starting down that path and down any path.
Awesome. And I think Twitter seems to be really active for science. Are there any other, is that like the most active social media platform that you've seen? Or are there?
Um, I know Instagram is also, there's quite a big SciComm community on Instagram too. I don't dabble in like Facebook. It's just not
Mhm.
my realm of, that's all personal. But yeah,
Mhm.
Twitter and Instagram are great places. You can look at the SciComm hashtag, see what people are tweeting about. There are other science communities. So ComSciCon is for graduate students, but I know there's like SciComm Camp, and there are a couple other like smaller training. There's Beakerhead. There are other specialized training opportunities that
Sure.
maybe you don't want to pay to be at, but you can follow along with what they do and their mandates on Twitter or on social media channels.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
No
Great
problem.
info, and let's definitely keep in touch.
Yeah, sounds good.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.